Well, I feel like I'm definitely in the right place right now. This is where I need to be right now, right? This is where all of us need to be. I just want to say, just a quick aside, some of you know me, I studied anthropology, physical anthro as an undergraduate, and everyone says, well, we're sort of naturally conceived as competitive, we're related to the chimps, and look at the chimpanzees, they're always fighting, but many of you know we're also as related to the bonobos, and those are the lovers, right? Those are the lovers, we're as related to the bonobos, even though it's a cutesy story, it's actually factual. So we can re-envision how we understand each other, right, in our local and global spaces. So, without further ado, our next and final speaker really needs no introduction. Gar Alperovitz is co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative and co-chair of the Next System Project, a noted historian, political economist, activist, writer, and a government official. He has occupied roles as the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and is a former fellow of King's College, Cambridge University, Harvard's Institute of Politics, the Institute for Policy Studies, and a guest scholar at Brookings in Washington, D.C. But more than that, he is a very decent human being, and I'm very glad to introduce him. Help me welcome Gar.
Fantastic start today. What I think we've got going, and the two speakers before me opened two big dimensions. There is an enormous development on the ground, lots of experimentation, and there's a beginning political fight. As we discussed yesterday, we are entering, in my view, the prehistory of the transformation of the most powerful corporate systems in the world, and that we have a shot of opening that direction in a serious way, both politically and institutionally. And then the question becomes, the classic question about socialism, how do you build a humane socialism, a democratic socialism that actually works? And the classic arguments have always been socialism as was built, a phony socialism in the state socialist models of the Soviet Union, had centralization of power. How do you deal with large industry? How do we actually come up with a vision of the next system that is humane, functional, practical, and that we can put forward and speak clearly to all of our participants, not only the left, about what it is and what it would work, how it would work, and what we know about that. It's on the table. That's what the Next System Project is about. How do we begin a serious discussion of that? One part of it, obviously, is the massive need for a political struggle and the opening that Bernie has given us and what will follow up on that opening. It is critical that we take that momentum forward in a political way. No doubt about that. The next question is, what is the content? How do you actually build a transformative system? What does it look like if you don't like state socialism, as we've known it, and if you don't like corporate capitalism, and if you can build on some of the insights that we're beginning on the solidarity economy? We have pieces of the puzzle that you can see happening. You can see, for instance, the building now, we're starting to see state banks in North Dakota, which are giving people ideas of what to do in the city of Philadelphia and Santa Fe now. City-owned banks, a public model that you can grasp and see and could be spread around the country. We're seeing worker-owned cooperatives in many parts of the country, bringing up worker ownership as another concrete element beyond slogans, beyond theory, that show people what actually can be done. We're seeing neighborhood and city land trusts draw a circle around land, put a nonprofit corporation or a city government, and it is democratizing the ownership of land. Notice what I've said, banks, democratizing, worker ownership, land, different forms, plural forms of democratizing ownership. We have the possibility, we have seen it done. In the last great crisis, we nationalized General Motors, we nationalized Chrysler, and then we gave them back. The next round, when the next crisis comes, there's no reason why we can't build a movement that can keep those in public service, to make mass transit, to make high-speed rail, to transform the ownership into worker and community structures. So you begin to see other elements that are beginning. The banking system went down. They were de facto nationalized. We didn't call it that because we appointed the boards. When the next crisis comes, This is one area I disagree with Bernie. Bernie wants to break them up. That would be a step forward. And just as AT&T and Standard Oil showed us, after you break them up, they will get back together and regroup and be bigger again. The question becomes, how do we put forward a vision of how to put forward public banks at the national level? This is not impossible. It's being done all over the world, and get control of those systems. I'm trying to give you a sense that the word socialism is often very abstract. We actually have models around the country and around the world that are extremely practical, that give you handholds on a vision that takes you forward to a different model, and that you can actually work with and begin to build. The State Bank of North Dakota gives you something to hold on to. None of them are perfect. All of them open a dimension that can be developed over time, and in fact is being developed over time in different parts of the country. So we're putting political struggle together with the creation of alternatives on the ground, and then also there's an intellectual struggle, and it's critical because there actually have been problems with the state socialist models and with the extreme anarchist models. How do you actually think through systemic models for the largest corporate capitalist system in the history of the world? What does it mean to a continental system, 320 million people? How would you organize it? And it's a good question to begin to answer, and we're getting fragments. I've given you a couple fragments of the answer. So part of it is beginning to develop in specific communities models that go beyond elements. Let me clarify that. We need co-ops, we need banks, we need land trusts. Those are elements in a systemic solution. They are not a system. How do you begin to stabilize the economic base of a specific community? How do you end the destabilization? I'm from the Midwest. You can go out throughout the Midwest. Detroit lost 1 million people. Nobody cares where they went. Nobody asks where they went. But how would you stabilize the jobs in that community? How would you say we're going to build mass transit at the national level, begin to target the contracts to that city, and begin to build worker-owned companies to build that mass transit, and put together a planning system that actually showed people how you could do something concretely rather than destabilize the whole city? Many of the small experiments, the kinds of things that we've heard from the first speaker, wonderful things, get blown apart. They disappear when the city loses its base. So we need to actually think through, and people are beginning to think through, what that would look like without achieving excessive centralization of power. That's the traditional problem of all the large systems. How do you actually get a national solution that produces the local culture and experimentation and vibrancy that you need without excessive centralization of power, but also deals with planning in a way that can stabilize communities? Let me put it another way. The United States today produces something of the order of $200,000 per family of 4. Today. 200,000, if you broke up the economy today, divided it equally, it would be $200,000 for every family of 4 without the fancy new technologies. If the rate of growth of technology in the 21st century equals the rate of growth of technology in the 20th century, without the new technologies, that number will increase 7-fold over the coming 100 years. We are already at a place where a vibrant society, based on the existing technologies, could produce the 20-hour week and $100,000 for every family of 4, already, currently. So there's a massive political possibility inherent in the existing numbers. The questions we're now being asked are very much, as the last speaker said, how do we actually get a militant struggle? How do we build a politics coming out of this period? How do we begin to generate a broad national conversation about the next system and where we want to go? And on the other hand, how do we keep building on these models and taking them to an entirely different level? So let me give you some of the problems that really come up when you begin asking, are you really talking about changing the system? What does it look like? Then what do you do about large-scale entities? What do you do? Do you want to nationalize them? Do you want to regionalize them? In the United States, a particular problem we need to face, and it's a problem that has very, very little discussion except in some fragments in the Northwest and the Northeast. The country is gigantic. How do you actually have participatory democracy and national economic planning in a democratic form in a continental system of almost 3,000 miles and 320 million people. How do you do that? The obvious answer is you can't do it without breaking the country into regions of one scale. Most states are too small, the continent is too big, and so we have to begin to talk about regional solutions of some kind or another. That's beginning to happen too. There's a discussion in New England, there's a discussion in the upper Northwest, fragmentary discussion of what a regional society might begin to look like and how to decentralize power. That problem is on the agenda in front of us right now. And I think we need to begin to say that directly. It is almost impossible to imagine a continental system managed democratically without radical decentralization. So part of the struggle is to put forward concrete ideas beyond rhetoric that tell us and begin to debate concretely, like the Articles of the Confederation. How do we fight through the discussion that took place after the Constitution was started, which began to get very specific about how we talk about this? And I think we're beginning to see scholars and writers and activists beginning to talk about starting either at the worker ownership, some people start with community ownership, some people start with nationalization, and begin to suggest there are models that would actually fulfill values of equality, liberty, ecological sustainability, community, bringing that all together in a very different form that allows us to use the technologies, but it's also very hard-headed and practical about what's wrong with excessively centralized models and what's also wrong with excessively decentralized models. So there is an intellectual struggle as well, and it's an intellectual political struggle that's beginning in many parts of the country. The Next System Project has identified some 20 or 30 scholars who are activist scholars who are beginning to put forward different ideas. Richard Wolff, for instance, a Marxist scholar, is putting forward worker ownership as the central idea, worker ownership of every institution, of every economic institution. Another idea, obviously, is public ownership. A third idea is city ownership, municipal ownership. And each one, as you know from Boulder's, the example of Boulder, where they've begun taking over the public utility in order to deal with climate change problems, a citywide discussion. There's even an experimentation going on. Some of you know about the Cleveland model, but I want to talk to you about the Cleveland model, the Rochester model, and further models. The Cleveland model is not simply freestanding worker-owned companies. One of the problems of freestanding worker-owned companies in a capitalist market is that they have to face all the problems of capitalism. If they don't grow and cut costs, the next freestanding worker cooperative might. Not because they want to, but because they'll go out of business if their market disappears. So there's a problem, and sometimes even worker co-ops are not good about environmental issues. Why? Because it's expensive, and if they have to add costs to deal with the environment and the next worker co-op doesn't, they're in trouble because they lose their market. So there are problems with worker-owned co-ops that we need to solve in a different way to begin to deal not only with the culture, but with the economic pressures of high technology society and a society that forces them into capitalist modalities. So we haven't worked that out. In Cleveland, there's an experiment, many of you know about the Evergreen model, which is a very primitive experiment, but it's an attempt to anchor worker-owned cooperatives in a community-wide structure responsible to the community. And in order to deal with some of these questions, so some of the profits go to the community, not just to the worker-owned firms. And there's even a quasi-planning model. Part of the way, if you think about this model, you could think about it nationally or locally. That is, public hospitals and universities, which have a lot of Medicare money and education money, and they purchase a great deal of goods and services. In that particular city, they buy $3 billion with a B dollars in goods and services, most of it from capitalist firms. Some of it is now being directed as a matter of policy to sustain worker-owned companies and to sustain a complex that builds the entire community, not just some worker-owned companies. So it's a model that is both community and worker-owned, more complex, and using public planning. That is a planning system. It's a planned market when you use public resources to stabilize the market. That would be, if you translate it nationally, that would be mass transit and high-speed rail at the national level, targeted to the construction of mass worker-owned and community-owned building of railroads and cars and mass transit and buses, using the planning system also to stabilize structures that are democratically owned, but stabilize the economies of local communities. That's the next step in thinking through models that actually begin with community, but also are very thoughtful and strategic about what a planning system looks like to stabilize the communities. These models in Rochester, New York, they're taking another step from the Cleveland model, which is a highly undemocratic model. It's an experiment, a prototype. It suggests a direction. The next step in Rochester looks to be more democratically controlled. And there are some discussions in certain cities in California of taking that even further to worker community control in a progression of ideas, but also very sophisticated about what the actual model begins to look like. If we are on the threshold, if we are near the threshold, and I agree with the last two speakers, something very big has changed. If we're on the threshold of opening the way to what we call the next system, to some form of democratic, radically decentralized socialism of a different form in which the enormous resources of these systems are already at $200,000 for every family of four. It's already available. A very different life could be available. How we build a politics that takes advantage of the available technologies, but also is sophisticated about how we transcend the models, the failed models of socialism and capitalism of the past. How we build something very authentic, experimental, starting at the premises of the solidarity economy, militant in its politics, but sophisticated in its vision. So in some funny way, part of the struggle is intellectual. Part of it is everyone beginning in the constitutional debate actually doing what was done after the Constitution, fighting for a different vision, thinking about it, beginning to see the possibilities that are inherent in this moment. Yesterday when we talked about this, the suggestion I made was that we are actually running out of the ways in which they stabilized the American system, primarily through military groups, but military spending has radically declined from 14% in 1950 during the Korean War to about 8 or 9% during the 60s, now down in the 3 to 4% range, and no longer are people willing to support that massive spending for war. One of the big stabilizers of the economy is disintegrating. And with the disintegration, more and more pain, but more and more political demand for a different solution. And I think we're into that era. I would put it even more strongly. In the 19th century, one of the ways they stabilized the system was they kept taking land and actually destroying people, the native populations, going west, and they used slavery to manage the system. They did until they got to the end of the 19th century and ran out of land. In the 20th century, I think they're running out of war as a way to stabilize the system. And that means we're opening up a whole different space for a very radical conversation. And I think it becomes our responsibility not only to struggle and politically, but to struggle in terms of projects and on-the-ground examples of how to go forward, the solidarity economy. And also there is an intellectual struggle. What really do we mean if you want to transform a system? What does it look like? How do you put the pieces together in a way that, I always think of it this way. I'm from an industrial town in the Midwest, Racine, Wisconsin. If I go back to Racine, how do I explain it in ordinary language to my high school buddies who are sitting in that decaying town? What does it mean beyond rhetoric? And how do we put together a picture that we could actually describe to our fellow citizens? I think that becomes part of the political as well as the intellectual challenge of our period. It is maybe, I would suggest to you, that we are living in the most important period of American history and possibly world history, as these questions are actually before us in a practical way, not in a rhetorical way and not in a theoretical way. So the ball is in our court, each and every one of us. Thank you very much.